Thank you for coming. I hope if you don't like it, just leave during the... but please don't slam the door, okay? okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a presentation of my... can you hear me? No. Because it's secret. Okay. Should I speak louder? Yes. Okay, so... Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this presentation of a kind of my reflections on the history of the novel. The novel being for us, at this point, probably the most, I don't know if I can say the most important literary genre, but the literary genre with which we are most in touch in our time. So I started to teach the history of the novel more than 20 years ago, not very early in my life, but still at some point when I was asked to teach on the university on the East Coast where I was before being here at Chicago. I was asked to teach the history of the novel, and I adopted the most common approach and decided to begin with Don Quixote by Cervantes. Don Quixote, which is the story, as everybody knows, of some a nobleman, not very wealthy, in late 16th century Spain, who read lots and lots of chivalric novels, and he wanted to be a true heroic knight in a country which really didn't need this because they had their own police. It was very well organized, and he went for adventures, and each adventure ended very badly. Almost like in a Chaplin movie, he was beaten up and suffered at every of this. So this was, by many people consider this to be the first modern novel, because this novel said no to older heroic chivalric novels. And I realized also that national pride in Europe being what it was and still is, each nation claimed to have its own first modern novel. So in Spain and also in other countries, Don Quixote. But if you move a little bit north to France, you are told that La Princesse de Clèves, the Princess of Clèves, Madame de Lafayette, is the first modern novel, a little bit later in the 17th century. In England, the first modern novel used to be considered Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe, 18th century. And in Russia, the first modern novels are obviously those written by Russian authors, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. They are, before that, it was not so good. Okay? So, and I started, but then, you know, at some point, teaching, starting with Don Quixote, I was interested to read the novels Don Quixote read. And the medieval knights he imitated. And this is when I read Amadis de Gaula, which was the favorite novel of Don Quixote, who imitated Amadis. A novel considered as being completely out of fashion, is the old kind of novels, has nothing to do with us. And as I acknowledge in a book that I was just published a few weeks ago, The Lives of the Novel, A History, okay, by Princeton University Press, as I said there, I loved it. I loved it. It is this knight, this very strong and valiant knight, who has various missions. People come to him to tell him that there is this, in this castle, there are these things that happen against justice, and he runs through the medieval forest to the castle and fights for justice and wins at every single episode. And the episodes that are not so well connected with each other. There is no general movement of the action. There is just this Amadis who fights for justice, as reestablishes justice every time. So, you know, I sort of realized that this is what we see on TV when we watched, as people my age used to watch Hawaii 05, the old version, or LAPD, without any kind of long-term plot. Each time these people save justice, okay? So maybe it's not, maybe I thought it's not so bad, it's not so completely out of fashion in these older novels. And after reading Amadis de Gaula, I read the oldest, one of the oldest such novels, called The Ethiopian Story, The Ethiopian Story by Heliodorus. So the Ethiopian, we don't know much about, we don't know in fact anything about Heliodorus, except that he was one of these, he lived in one of these Greek colonies on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and the novel is probably written in the between the 2nd and the 4th century at some point. And I must say that this was one of the revelations of my lifetime. Okay? It is so beautiful, it is so convincing. And then I understood, I think at that point, I understood how the novel evolves through centuries. This is, Heliodorus, the Ethiopian Story, is the, it is the story of two young lovers, two young people, a man and a woman, who meet at the Delphi festival at some point. They are, she believes that she's Greek. Her name is Chariclea, and he is Greek. He comes from the family of Achilles. Okay, so, and they meet there, and there is a love at first sight. They are deeply in love with each other, and a Egyptian priest who happens to be around, Calasiris, protects them and helps them run away together, because her family wants her to marry a wealthy Greek merchant. And in order to run away, she requires him to take an oath of chastity, which he is a bit offended that she suspects him of being unchaste. So he takes the oath, and they run away, and they will cross the Mediterranean and meet one adversity and one ordeal after the other. They are kidnapped by pirates, zillions of things happen to them, and always their strength, inner strength, chastity, and a kind of a secret alliance that you realize at the end, a secret alliance with Providence, helps them little by little reach Ethiopia. And once in Ethiopia, it turns out that the Egyptian priest who was protecting them knew her secret, namely that she was the daughter of the king and queen of Ethiopia. Okay. Okay. So they arrived there, and in the end they marry, but not before her mother recognized them. The father accepts her. I will tell you exactly why she could not live in Ethiopia in a second, but not before the king, under the pressure of the people who are around and see all these events at a festival in Ethiopia, and changes the law, because in Ethiopia there was a law, a legendary law, that every foreigner has to be killed. It was an immigration kind of very, 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 as you said exactly, very serious. And the king listens to the people and changes this law, and foreigners will from then on considered as equal human beings and allowed to live there. It is an extraordinarily beautiful novel, which was not so successful in the ancient times. It was not so successful because people still read the Iliad the Odyssey, the Greek tragedies, and this, the language is not necessarily the most elegant, and it's something that you don't notice if you are lucky enough to read it in translation. As some of the people I know here realized a few years ago about Proust, who in English is much easier than in French, okay? Don't betray me, don't tell anybody I said that. So it was a little bit forgotten. It was read in the Byzantine Empire, but it was rediscovered in Western Europe only at the beginning of the 16th, in the mid-16th century, translated into all European languages, French, Spanish, Italian, German, English. Everybody read this Ethiopian story by Heliodorus, including Cervantes. And there was a debate. Started, in fact, by the French preface of the translation done by Jacques Amiot, a great translator, Plutarch's translator into French, and who in this preface says, finally, a kind of novel that speaks about reality. Okay, not like these medieval chivalric novels that are about sorcerers and sorceresses and magic horses and unbelievable things. And when you read the Ethiopian story, he adds, you realize that perhaps these older chivalric stories were written by somebody who had a kind of a sickness in his brain. I don't have the, anyway, I have the word here, but it doesn't matter. This is the idea, sickness in his brain. And this preface was translated into Spanish because the Spanish translation comes from the French translation, not directly from Greek. And this is something that everybody was debating. Who is the winner, the medieval stories or the Ethiopian story? Back to Cervantes. I realized, reading all this, I realized that, in fact, Cervantes' latest novel, written after Don Quixote, and published the year after his death, because he finished it at the last moment. He was already sick, and the last chapters are written in a hurry, is a novel that I happen to have read, but I didn't realize its importance. It was called Persiles and Sigismunda. Persiles and Sigismunda. It's not well known, and it's not necessarily the best novel by Cervantes, but Cervantes believed sincerely, and he says it in the preface, that this is his claim to immortality, because it is a imitation of the Ethiopian story by Heliodorus and a bit Christianized, because these people, instead of reaching Ethiopia, they reach Rome. And it's safer, okay? They don't cross them. Okay, and they are, instead of being blessed by the king and queen of Ethiopia, they are blessed by the Pope. Okay, at the end, at the very end. So, and then I started to think about the following thing. Cervantes clearly agreed that this is the true model. And he clearly agreed that the medieval chivalric novels are not what we should continue. And so he had a project in two steps, I would say. First, make fun of the older novels, of the chivalric novels. This is Don Quixote. He makes fun of, they are no good. Make fun of Amadis. Make fun of these sort of out-of-fashion ideals of the chivalric novel, and then assert the new true model, the Heliodorus model in Persiles. So what about there is no such a thing as necessarily the first modern novel? What about seeing the evolution of the novel as a long continuity? And what about not necessarily thinking that everybody over centuries looked for realism more and closer and closer to reality. Amiot believed that the older novels, the Heliodorus type of novels, are more real than the medieval ones. But are they so real? They are not real at all. It's just a example. What is so beautiful in Heliodorus is the Ethiopian story is precisely the way it idealizes human beings. These are idealized human beings. They are incredibly strong. They are incredibly devoted to each other in a faithful and absolutely chaste way. And they have a secret alliance with the Providence that incredibly protects them all the way from Greece to Ethiopia. And it also represents a world in which the borders between nations did not fully count anymore. Because she was born in Ethiopia, raised up in Greece, and she does. Is she Greek? Is she Ethiopian? It was the world of the Roman Empire which unified the whole Mediterranean, and what counted was just that people were individuals. And they are in a way, this couple is in a way a couple outside the world. It crosses the world, reaching for a legendary country, Ethiopia, okay, without completely knowing this. And so I sort of realized yet another thing. For a long time we were told that the novel is the modern epic, is the epic of the bourgeois society. This is what Hegel said. Hegel was a great philosopher who read 3 or 4 novels in his lifetime. I mean, it's better than nothing, okay? It's infinitely better than 0, okay? But I don't think that he was interested. He was not a literary historian. He had a very, very interesting made general points, but on this one, he was not right. Because the epic, the ancient epic, is about heroes who are deeply, deeply bound to their tribe and to their city. And they fight these wars for their tribe or for their city. While these two people, Chariclea and Theagenes, the main characters in Heliodorus' story, they cross the world. They are not fighting for their own tribe or city. She does not have really her own tribe or city. They represent something else. Is a discovery of of individuals who are not completely bound to a place in this world. Okay. So the novel has its own autonomous, independent, long history, and initially it is a idealist genre which idealizes human beings. And the way the ancient novel, there are a few other ancient novels that idealize human beings, there are also the medieval novel does the same thing. The authors of who wrote these stories about Yvain or about Tristan or about the knights around King Arthur, they were also idealizing their characters. So there is a long tradition of idealizing human beings. Right? But it could not possibly be the only one. And I realized that a parallel to this idealizing tradition, there is also another tradition which makes fun of human beings. And sort of is a derogatory tradition, which is human beings are so terribly imperfect. They are so bad, okay? Or they cannot do anything properly, or they are really evil. And then you immediately think of an ancient Latin novel, Satyricon by Petronius, I cannot, because there are young people here, I cannot tell you the story. Okay, you should not read it. Okay, but the main characters are just lost. They don't know what they are doing. They are completely imperfect. They are in the Middle Ages, at the same time as the most beautiful and the most noble chivalric novels. At the same time, an author who preferred to remain anonymous, and I know why, wrote the story of Renard the Fox, which has been translated in many languages and very much moderated, because if you read the original, it is so caustic, it is so, Renard is really a complete anarchist. He's a complete, no, it's not right, because he's a nobleman who is keeping his privileges, but he is so, he has such pleasure in doing exactly what should not be done, okay? Okay. And this parallel tradition is always alive. A great French author, Rabelais belongs to this tradition. His character, Panurge is somebody very, very bad. He's a terrible misogynist, okay? But however, people laugh. People laugh because he is at the same time funny, evil, and he sort of flatters in each of us the desire that I hope most of us know how to master, of being bad. and the language is very funny. So this is a long tradition. And towards the, at the same time, a little bit earlier than Cervantes, some Spanish author, the first of being anonymous, we don't know who he was, started to take this tendency of being always dishonest and doing exactly what you should not do, to take it a little bit more seriously. And instead of making just funny characters that they do stupid things that in order to make us laugh, they started to reflect on the seriousness of this situation. And this is the beginning of what people call the picaresque novels. The picaros being just these people who are usually very poor. They come from a completely underprivileged background, and they need to survive. They need to survive, and they survive by lying, stealing, being dishonest, and again, there's one episode after the other. They steal, they are caught. They lie, they are caught. They earn lots of money by cheating at cards, and they will immediately lose their money. No, okay. Okay. Okay, I'm not here. Okay, so these characters can be of two kinds. Some of them are just dishonest, amoral. They don't even realize that they are immoral. They are doing naively without having any kind of moral consciousness. And the first example is Lazarillo de Tormes. Again, anonymous, because it meant, it was a gesture of courage just to describe such a character, okay? And then, a little bit later, there is another kind of Picaro, a Picaro that does lots of bad things, just like the amoral Picaros, but he writes much later his memoirs, and after each misdeed, you describe, let's say, in 2 or 3 pages, you have the right of another 2 or 3 pages of a sermon, in which he says, look how bad I was, I did not take into account. Okay? These are the preaching Picaros, And little by little, this parallel genre, this parallel sort of anti-idealist, or more realist if you want, as opposed to the idealizing line, they start to think also about women. They have picaras who do various lots of things, and Daniel Defoe, in Moll Flanders, in Moll Flanders, he just continues this genre and presents us this great character, Moll Flanders, who is one of these moralizing Picaros. She is a woman in a society in which it was very, very difficult, I would say impossible for women to be independent. So she just wants to have a good husband. That's the only thing. She's not a modern type of feminist, but she understands the situation of women in her society, and she understands that she cannot find a good husband. She finds one. I don't want to tell you. Those of you who didn't read the story, you have to read it because it's one of the best earlier English novels. And finally, she, after a life of, how to put it, after a life which is not very moral, she at the end understands what morality means, and she converts, and she will lead a happy life in Virginia. Yes, yeah, because she is exiled. She was condemned to death by hanging for having stolen something, you know, because England was super tough in the 18th century. Whatever you did, death penalty. Stealing, death penalty. Killing 15 people, death penalty. But because of her very sincere remorse, because she understands that the man she loved was suffering also because of one of her misdeeds, they both convert, and they convince the pastor of the prison, and their pain is commuted to exile, and they are happy. They make lots of money in Virginia. Okay, another interesting novel by even stronger by Daniel Defoe, which is less known, also is very interesting, is Roxana. It is Roxana, the story of a woman who is also completely aware of the situation of women who depended entirely on marriage and on their husband. So she marries a fool, as she says, and she's very unhappy, and she decides to live alone. She decides to live alone, and she becomes a courtesan, okay? And she is fighting for her independence. But it so happens that, no, I won't tell you. Okay. So what I wanted to say is that there were, I identified at least these two major lines: an idealizing line and a counter or a derogatory line, a satirical line, a line which emphasizes the human imperfection. Also, looking a little bit of the situation around Cervantes, I realized there were other genres, and that until the 18th century, people who wanted to read a novel had to choose between, not just only between these two very well-defined subgenres, but there were other subgenres, very well-defined. It's just as we go, let's say, to a bookstore. We go to a bookstore and we see, you know, mysteries or fiction or philosophy, and we know exactly what we will find there. The people in the 16th, 17th century, they knew exactly what they were buying. They were buying one of these Heliodorus-like novels, and there were many, many of them, some of them huge, thousands of pages, okay? They were buying a picaresque novel, a completely different thing. They are buying a pastoral novel, the pastoral being a genre in between with this, they took place in an Arcadian space, a happy space where people did not yet discover property and they were not yet jealous of each other. They were, and the only thing they were doing, they were taking care of their sheep and singing about their love. They are singing aloud or talking aloud about their love, and there was always somebody hidden not far from that and listening and discovering their secrets, okay? Okay. an important genre, and Cervantes wrote a beautiful pastoral, Galatea, and a more dramatic genre, because all these genres had, as I said, an episodic structure, like the TV series. In each episode, a chivalric, a knight did a great deed. In each episode, the lovers in Heliodorus or the imitations of Heliodorus were stronger than yet another adversity. In each picaresque novel, the Picaro or the Picara plays another trick, okay? And there were, on the contrary, some stories which emphasized the unity of action. And they were much shorter, and they, instead of emphasizing a chain of events, all of them underlying the same idea over and over again, justice, nobility, or on the other hand, dishonesty, trickstery, and so on, each of them made one important point. This genre, this other subgenre, is the novella. And it was developed in Italy by great writers like Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron, this less known Bandello, Cinzio. We know about these stories because many of them, having the unity of action, were adapted by playwrights. And for instance, Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare takes a story from Bandello. Otello comes from Cinzio. They were just ideal for dramas precisely because of their shortness, the unity of action, and emphasis on one catastrophe or one comic situations in some of Boccaccio's stories. And here comes, in the 18th century, a very, very smart Englishman who was, in fact, a businessman. He had a printing shop, and he was into printing, and he was publishing successful books. You know, at that time, I don't know if you ever had this kind of stuff. When I was young, we still had them. This manual of correspondence, how to write letters for various occasions, for you know, thanking for being invited, for condolences. He was publishing also this kind of, and he was writing them himself, this kind of handbook, how to write letters in various situations. His name was Samuel, and family name Richardson. Samuel Richardson. And this businessman said, I will write also a novel. I will write a novel. And just a little bit, as you know, these kind of machines include everything you need in one little machine. It's just on the same principle. He included something from every single separate genre into one novel. And this novel is not so bad. It's good, I think. It's not the most perfect novel, but it is very, very important for this kind of craftsman's innovation, okay? It's Pamela by Richardson. Later, he wrote probably the best novel of the 18th century, Clarissa by Richardson, an extraordinary novel, but let's talk a little bit about Pamela. Pamela is one of these ideal characters. She is a completely strong and chaste young woman, but instead of being a Ethiopian princess who lives far away in another era, she is a little bit more plausible because she lives in England, in the countryside, and she also is of a modest origin, which adds a new moral dimension, the moral equality between people of a humble extraction and the nobility. And this Pamela is also she's more lonely than Chariclea and Theagenes in Heliodorus. They were at least a couple that supported each other. She is completely lonely because she has to resist the man who is in love with her, who is her master, Mr. B, a corrupt master who tries constantly, who wants, sorry to say this in contemporary, wants to sleep with her. That's all he wants. And she is a virtuous young woman, and she writes constantly letters to her parents explaining what's going on. The letters never leave the house of her master because she cannot possibly send them. And that's very important, you'll see why. And the master tries various things. He even tries to rape her. But for some reason, he's not really a completely corrupt person, because he's shy at the last minute in this rape scene. It's something which is both a little bit comic, but also moving. It's a moving moment. And he's so mad at her that he decides to find out what she's doing in this little room where she's constantly writing, and he reads her letters. And reading her letters, he understands that his servant is not only nice, pretty, and so on, but she is also morally superior to him. And he slowly starts to understand that his behavior is not the right one, and in the end, he asks her to marry him, and you realize that she also was not completely indifferent to her master, and they marry, and they will be forever happy. So what we have here is a mixture. You have the idealist novel, the perfect virtuous woman. We have something for the picaresque, a woman of a humble extraction who doesn't have any kind of money or anything, but instead of behaving badly, she will behave in a virtuous way. So there is a little bit of the picaresque here. There is from the novella, there is the unity of action, because there is just one thing that happens, and there is a clear line, okay, going towards the resolution. And also you have the pastoral, because some of this hesitation about love come from he sells in one novel what his public, his readers, would have needed to buy 5 novels or books in order to. It was one of the greatest success ever he also wrote a comprehensible English. Right away, the opposite side, the people who want to make fun of us human beings and show that we are not perfect, reacted. And this is the Henry Fielding immediately wrote a little parody, which, like Pamela, is an epistolary novel, which is called Shamela. And it has exactly the same story, except that Shamela had various affairs in her life before becoming his servant, and she decides to seduce her master, pretending to be very virtuous and everything. And her master is also, he makes fun of that scene that I mentioned about his master is completely undersexed, and she sort of despises him for that, and manages in the end to, I don't remember. Anyway, doesn't matter. You read it. I must say that okay. So Henry Fielding, after publishing this short anti-idealistic parody, writes a longer one, Joseph Andrews. Pamela's family name is Andrews, Pamela Andrews. And Henry Fielding gives her a brother, Joseph Andrews, who is just as virtuous as she is. He is a servant of a lady who is a widow, and the lady is very interested in Joseph, but Joseph is very virtuous always, and just rejects her exactly the way in which Pamela rejects her master. And the novel continues as an imitation of Don Quixote. And for the first time, somebody sees Cervantes as the author of a first important model. Fielding is the author. Fielding is the source of this idea that Cervantes is the origin of the novel. And Fielding says in the preface of Joseph Andrews, the novel should not be very idealistic, to imagine all these romantic adventures with perfect beings that are completely implausible. The novel should be comic. The essence of the novel is to be the comic epic, as he calls it. Okay? Richardson writes Clarissa. It's 1,500 pages in a big penguin. Very, very slow, but if people who have the strength to go through the whole thing and the time are rewarded, because it is. And at that point, Fielding understood that he was not fair. He had not been fair towards Richardson, and they became friends. They became friends. He understood also the other possibility, but his own literature, his own novels, Tom Jones, for instance, continue to have a kind of a skeptical, ironic attitude towards human being, towards the way. You realize all these people thought about something very, very important. The relationship between us, human beings, individual human beings, and the moral ideals. We have moral ideals. This is obvious that we have moral ideals. Do we follow them? Sometimes. The idealized characters follow them all the time. The other characters, the Picaros, never follow them. So the main issue is this tense relationship between us and what we ought to do, but don't always. Video meliora pro bogue. I see the best and I approve it, but sometimes I follow the worst. Okay? So this tension is had been for a long time what gave life to the novel. And I must say, it continues. It continues in the 19th century because suddenly, certainly an ancient princess who is absolutely virtuous and travels through storms and pirates from Greece to Ethiopia is not entirely plausible. But this incredibly virtuous Pamela is not completely plausible either, as Fielding showed in Shamela. Why is she so virtuous? She's so virtuous because she has a Methodist background, as critics later pointed out. But this is not something that Richardson emphasizes at all. You just understand it if you are a 20th or 21st century critic. Why human greatness is there? Why do we find people who are extraordinarily virtuous and powerful? Why? What are the roots of greatness? They are historical roots. And that's the 19th century answer. People like Walter Scott, for instance, starts to think about human greatness, about these ideal characters in relationship with the historical and cultural environment. It's a big discovery. I don't know if you like Walter Scott, if you ever happen to read The Heart of Midlothian by less people read it nowadays. It was a very, very popular novel at the beginning of the 19th century in which you have this kind of incredibly strong character, Jenny Deans, who is incapable to lie under oath. Her sister is accused of child murder, although it's clear that she did not. She had an illegitimate child that disappeared, but she did not kill the child. And her sister will be condemned to death because nobody can testify under oath in her favor, including her sister, who believes that her this unfortunate young woman is innocent, but she cannot say it under oath because she was raised in a very, very, very strict Scottish Protestant environment. So a young woman who cannot possibly lie under oath has the courage to alone go from Edinburgh to London without money, having very, very little money, and going finally through a protector of the Scottish people at the court of Queen Anne, goes to the Queen, explains to the Queen the whole situation, and the Queen will pardon her sister. So suddenly you have this kind of incredible strength, but it is historically explained. We know why. We know the culture, her background, her family background explains why she behaves this way. And this is a lesson that will, Walter Scott is very interested in a variety of historical horizons. He has all these historical novels, including Ivanhoe, and in which he shows strength and heroism, pointing out to its historical motivation. Okay? And this is something that will be inherited by the French great novelist Balzac, who sees in Walter Scott the interest for the social, historical, and cultural milieu, but Balzac, instead of applying it to history, applies it to his society, to the French society of the beginning of the 19th century, and he will write a huge cycle of novels that he calls the human comedy, alluding to Dante's The Divine Comedy. And in this human comedy, you will find virtually every profession, every kind of human behavior, every kind of sexual interest. He is interested in everything. Very, very interesting. And he is an author who also wants to explain to you what happens. And there are dramas, there are ideal characters, there are there are bad characters, there is always interaction. And suddenly he says, voici pourquoi. And listen why. Listen why. And he will have 5 or 6 pages of historical, social explanations, cultural explanation of what happened. So he's very well aware of that. So I would say that in the 19th century, this tension between the idealism and counter-idealism, of, if you want to call it realism, continues. And you have, in English literature, you will have somebody like Dickens. Can you believe Oliver Twist? You would like to. Can you believe The Old Curiosity Shop? It's a novel that everybody despises, all the modernists despise. Oh, it's so sentimental. And I myself did not read it until late. It's one of the novels I could not read without crying, okay? I'm not ashamed of that. It's sentimental. This is why I love it, okay? So I always tell my students, don't be afraid of people who call various novels kitsch. Don't be kitsch is a term meant to terrorize you. Just believe your heart. This doesn't mean that the modernist novels are not as good as they're interesting, absolutely, but there is a polemic there. So I will stop here and conclude. First of all, the history of the novel is a history of polemics, of tension, of debate between the ideals and the imperfection. And it's always about the human struggle to truly inhabit this world, following these ideals or negating them. And this story is not completely solved yet. But what is important, and that will be my last statement here, what is so important in the 19th, 20th century is a separation, at some point, a separation in the democratic societies, in the societies in which people can virtually all read, they have access to literacy, they have enough money to buy a book. There is a separation between a high literature, which becomes sort of higher and higher, and it's for the connoisseur only, and a more popular literature, a literature which is for the great numbers. And I think that Balzac Victor Hugo, Dickens were the last writers who tried to write for both publics. But at some point, you'll have writers who want to write just for those who really worship art, and there will be writers who write for those who just want some excitement, some action, and so on. And I would say it's wonderful to love Ulysses by Joyce, but there is nothing wrong in watching 15 or 25 times The Lord of the Rings. Okay, that's it.